All right, everybody, welcome everybody to the Environmental Communication Seminar in the program on the environment at the University of Washington. My name is Sean McDonald, and I'm the instructor for this course and also the host for this evening. We've got a fantastic speaker here in week 5, Hannah Weinberger, Science and Environmental Staff Reporter for Crosscut, KCTS 9, and Cascade Public Media. She's reported on a range of environmental sustainability topics around the Pacific Northwest. Let's go ahead and give it up for Hannah. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to go ahead and read a brief bio, if I will. Okay.
Oh, no.
No, this is good stuff. I think I shared this with you already. Hannah Weinberger is a reporter at Crosscut, part of KCTS 9 PBS in Seattle, focused on science and environmental coverage. She writes about outdoor recreation, natural resources, natural disasters, wildlife management, environmental and health sciences, and similar areas in which tensions arise between society and the environment, and the consequences of treating those worlds as separate. Hannah believes outdoor sports and field sciences are powerful vehicles through which to learn about the outdoors, and that educated guesses and the confidence to follow them lead us to some of the most valuable lessons about nature and ourselves. Prior to joining Crosscut, Hannah vetted outdoor gear for Wirecutter, briefly freelanced, edited for Bicycling Magazine, and was an editorial assistant in Outside Magazine. So a broad range of experiences. Her seminar today is titled News Clues, Putting Together a News Story as New Information Arises. And as soon as I heard that, I was thinking, News Clues, News Clues, man. Okay, anyway, so y'all, for today, just as a reminder, Hannah's going to speak for a bit, so maybe about 30 minutes or so, I think, and then we're going to jump into a Q&A. For those of you who are joining us online via YouTube, just so you are aware that at the end of Hannah's presentation, I will stop the live stream, so you will be cut off before the Q&A. But folks who are on the Zoom, please, if you have questions for our speaker, you can add them to the chat or raise your little digital hand and ask those questions live for our guests and the rest of the audience. Please feel free to turn on your camera and ask those questions at that time. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our guest.
Hi, thank you so much for that, Sean. It is great to be with all of you today. I was really touched that I was invited to chat with you all. I remember getting to talk with journalists when I was in school was some of what made me go down this path. So let's start. So this presentation is News Clues, Piecing Together News Stories. And so before I dig in, what is it that I do that might give you some insight into how skills that you're learning might transfer? I'll start by saying that I am also still learning. Nothing I'm sharing today is prescriptive. I anticipate I'll be learning a lot from all of you about how to do my job soon, and I'm always changing my approach to accommodate new information, and that's foreshadowing for the rest of this presentation. But hopefully I have a lot that can help give you some insight into what's next for you. So I am a science and environment reporter for Crosscut, an online multimedia magazine that's part of a public media superstation, Cascade Public Media, and its sister organization, KCTS 9 PBS, like Sean mentioned. While I'm focused mainly on long-form feature written reporting, there is so much room for creativity in expressing the information I learn in the course of reporting. I collaborate with people doing audio, photo, video projects, and Crosscut utilizes me for a lot of different things. In the course of my job, which I've been doing for a little over 4 years, I have interviewed with our on-staff podcast host to give readers deeper insight into my work. I've interviewed sources for video live streams as part of Crosscut's festival. I've created some social media engagement strategies around my work, written essays about my reporting process, shot my own photos and video. There's a lot of opportunity. And I regularly represent Crosscut outside the station interviewing for local radio, doing onstage local programming, interviewing for newsletters, and especially getting to chat with people who are also really jazzed about how we learn about the world, like this class. As far as my approach, I have a lot of leeway to shape the focus of my work. I have taken to calling my beat environmental adaptation, focusing on how humans and wildlife adapt to changing spaces and each other with an eye on equity. It pretty much all has to do with climate change, but not always explicitly. The ways we interact with and perceive the built and natural environment are varied. And when it comes to science, a through line I like to focus on is the human side of it. That includes revealing that science is a process and often a reflection of what people want to know and think they need to know. The application of science, how it is a tool that we can use to keep people and the planet healthier or better learn about the world around us and deepen appreciation for it. Also, the unintended consequences of applying solutions without fully understanding our world. I also like to look at our relationships with the planet and how our perception of nature affects the way we treat it and each other. By focusing on how policy and science affect things in the quote unquote real world, it helps me make decisions about story framing. I'm always trying to translate science in a way that doesn't speak down to people and to never lose focus that my job is helping people live a more informed, more empathetic life and to help them make decisions without telling them what to do. So here's a little photo of me that one of my colleagues took. I was interviewing a birder, and our job isn't always glamorous, but you do get to often wear whatever you want, which is pretty cool. All right. So I want to start off by thinking about what an article is before we go into how we actually report it out. So when I say story or article, it's a loaded word. A story can take so many forms, and you can tell most stories well in more than one format. The key is figuring out which style is the one that will engage and resonate most with your audience in a given circumstance and on a timeline that works for your editor. If any of you have been part of student journalism organizations, that last part probably made you think of a specific story experience that you have worked on. When you're telling a story, I like to think about it as I'm telling a story about X as a Y, where X is the content and Y is the framing or the vehicle. So for example, I'm telling a story about gaps in pollution regulation as a listicle. I don't know if I would read that, but that's an example. I won't bore you with all of the types of approaches that I or other reporters have taken to stories, but here are a couple examples of some story themes that journalists will commonly use, and you will likely recognize a lot of them, or maybe you've even written some in these styles yourselves if you're on like a student newspaper. All right. So I love Q&As. They can really give readers a front row seat to the reporting and can create room to really chew on some tough topics with people who think about them deeply. They're really easy to do poorly. A Q&A is a good choice when you want to profile a significant person willing to approach a topic candidly from different perspectives, but you can't just share an hour's worth of audio with your audience most of the time because people have attention spans. The most recent Q&A I did was with a local MacArthur Genius Grant Award winner, Yejin Choi, who actually works for UW. She specializes in AI, and instead of just reporting out a story like, Seattle, we got another one, like, here's what she does. I wanted to chat with her pretty deeply about her relationship with her work, the care people take in applying its findings and the limitations of the technology she was developing, because she's in a powerful position researching something that affects all of us. And these were questions a lot of people had that she has expertise in. There's also solution stories. I love these. Instead of just reporting out how screwed we are and who's the most screwed, which is what climate reporting has frequently been, it's humanity affirming to look at people, especially in grassroots programs, trying to figure out ways to turn the tide on a problem. I think people used to be wary of solutions reporting because it can look like marketing, like, you know, X group is developing the next thing that will remove our need for gasoline. Like, we're going to power all of our cars with cat poop. I don't know. Like, you don't want to just glorify something and leave it at that. You really want to interrogate it. So I a solution story can be kind of a watchdog opportunity too, evaluating the viability of something before it launches, or the difficulty in making a decision about what to do, or whether a moonshot strategy is really working, like the story that I highlighted on the screen, and who's in a position to decide what happens. We're going to get through some story types really quickly and then get into the meat of this. Another one is study stories. These have become a little bit of a punchline in science reporting, because like one day you'll read something that's like, study says chocolate will kill you, and the next it's chocolate will give you superpowers. So it's kind of like something people keep in mind, is to not necessarily say definitive things about single studies, and to look at science as a continuum that improves upon itself and continually integrates new information. But I like using new studies as vehicles through which to explore the field in which they are being done more broadly, and to dive into their areas of application. And what I mean by that is, for instance, a recent study came out about how marine parasites are declining in Puget Sound. And instead of just interviewing the researchers about why they thought that might be, I looked at what the study says about our relationships with parasites, why it might not be good that they're disappearing, and why this information is coming out now. Talking with parasitologists who weren't involved with the study as well. And so it really became a story about us and how we take in information about what we're learning about the world. Which, people can apply in the rest of their day, and not just thinking about, oh my God, this thing happened, but why did it happen? There's also the meta story. So I don't know if this is what every journalist calls it, but it's a story where, I talk to a lot of people, I read a lot, I experience a lot. I'm very privileged to do that. And sometimes I'm able to connect the dots on something in a way that shines a light on developments and reflects how people perceive the news. So I was writing a story that became a mini beat about what the way we talk, or an audience talks about a certain insect, says about how we relate to the environment and each other. I've been reporting stories trying to assess the actual ecological threat of some big non-native hornets that landed in Washington a few years ago, and was intrigued by how people responded to it. The story I eventually got greenlit was about that insect referred to as a murder hornet or Asian giant hornet, but which didn't have an official common name in the US at that time, and the implications of those names on how we treat wasps, hornets, and bees, as well as critically how that name impacts people of Asian descent, and the long history of names reflecting power structures and internalized colonialism and bigotry in the sciences. And it was really cool to be able to show people, this is how you are responding to the news that I am giving you. What does that say about, all of the proposed solutions to this problem that we're talking about in the news? And then it was cool to watch this story evolve into, the insect eventually did get a common name, and there were a couple follow-up stories to that. So the style I dabble in the least is breaking news. Like a give them the facts style story you'd see in a daily paper. That's not what Crosscut is set up for. It's not what we specialize in, but in some circumstances, I might have information that I think merits a breaking news story. And if I catch my editor on a good day, we can make that happen. I broke a story a while back on Twitter confirming a beluga whale sighting in Puget Sound, which hadn't happened in a very long time. And I followed it closely with a news story looking into the human reaction to it. All right, now that we've got a couple examples of ways that you might take a story out of the way, what I'm really excited to look at is not just the format of a story, but different approaches to reporting it out. The process of doing the news. News people try to anticipate what they'll need to cover, but sometimes we have to react in the moment. And I want to show you that even when you have what you think is the best idea of what you think you're going to do, and you have a plan, the process is never really linear. And you're very often changing tack midway through. I think it's really healthy to have a curiosity and an openness to being wrong when you go into a story, because if you try to impose what you think is happening on a story and that's not the story, then your audience will tell you. And you're not doing anyone, including yourself, any good if you're trying to report out not what you're actually seeing and observing and hearing from people, but what you just expected to find. I've been doing this for a decade, and there's real skill in knowing what questions you think your audience will have and setting yourself up to answer those questions. But sometimes maybe you've never reported on this topic before. You won't know what questions you or other people have until you're an interview or two deep. But having familiarity with a topic or story format and really keeping in mind why you got the green light to pursue something at all can help you build the muscle memory to know what information you're going to need to get quickly. And also, please stop me if I'm like, talking to you using jargon or vernacular that you don't know, or I'm like, there's something else that you'd rather hear me talk about. I can switch tack pretty fast. All right. So the first case study I want to look at is a reactive story. In September, some of you might remember this one day where people started panicking about Mount Rainier Tahoma erupting. And it was ultimately a matter of communicating without doing reporting. We all make mistakes. You need to learn from your mistakes and be transparent with your audience. So this isn't to, diss the reporter who was on this, or a meteorologist. But I want to show you a little bit of a video. Hopefully you'll be able to hear my
meteorologist, followed by many others.
All that got the attention from U.S. volcano officials.
Here.
Crazy would be a better word for it. Social media was just going crazy. And, it started from a post from a Seattle meteorologist, followed by many others. All that got the attention from U.S. volcano officials saying, no, everyone, the volcano was not erupting. It was a view that had Seattle in a panic. Okay, maybe not a panic, but it did have thousands of people a bit concerned, thinking they saw steam coming from the top of Mount Rainier, an active volcano that could erupt someday. But
you can see there this it looks like just kind of steam, right? So a meteorologist shared a video from a live feed of the mountain with some unidentified wispy elements at the top. Here, let me take off computer sound, and included their assessment of what was happening, which you can see in this tweet that I have a screenshot of here, before they'd gotten any information from people on the ground or people monitoring the mountain professionally. And when you decide to share information without confirmation, especially about emergency situations, that's a huge consideration, because you can cause panic unnecessarily and hurt reader trust down the line. I don't know what this meteorologist's process was there, but it ultimately backfired a little bit. Anyway, I saw this happening, and because I cover natural disasters and human environment relationships, I dropped my editor a note about the tweet and was like, maybe we should monitor this. And my editor was like, start reporting now. And it wasn't something I'd planned for. I'd never reported on an eruption before. I was like, oh God. And because I'm not a breaking news reporter, I had to think of different approaches. What context can I add? What's happening here? I was preparing to maybe have to do a story about a disaster situation, or change my direction quickly as new information arose. Brainstorming the kind of story I could write that would have a little longevity, and also be helpful in the event that it wasn't a disaster. So there were a lot of different ways that I could have gone at the beginning, and I was trying to get my head in the right place. I started thinking about the human response to this information, our relationship with and knowledge of volcanoes, and what I could not teach but communally consider with readers. And so what happened was people thought the mountain was erupting, and it ended up being a cloud. And it forced volcanologists at USGS, people who worked for Mount Rainier, Tacoma, people within Washington State Emergency Management to have to go on social media and just be like, no, we are there. We are looking at this. Nothing is erupting. None of our tools are saying that anything is happening. Please look to us first before you start going into that headspace. So the first thing I did was call and email people who were either at the mountain or who worked in volcanology related to the park or in emergency management to see, like, is this a thing? Like, this was before we had like final confirmation, or the organizations that monitor and study the mountain had like put out those notices. So I was trying to be like, okay, are we in an emergency situation before I start tweeting or trying to publish anything? Like, what's actually going on here? And the people who study the mountain were like, please, like, we really want to talk about this. And so I luckily avoided putting out any information that included, false reason to believe that we were going to be in a disaster situation for that reason. So the mountain's not erupting. Now we have some tension. The story's not about what I thought it was going to be about. As a science reporter, again, the insight I am able to add first is what's happening. What are the systems here? How do we know this? And so I chatted with the people who've spent their careers studying volcanoes and geology in the Pacific Northwest and got some good insight into the process of figuring out what was going on. So trying to tell people, okay, this is how you could have been. It's not silly to react this way. Like, it totally looks like it could be smoke. People do have to check their tools, all of the infrastructure that they have monitoring the mountain to eliminate the possibility that this thing is erupting. So first of all, put people in a space where they know, like, they're not an idiot. Yeah, they're not professional volcanologists, but like, this is a thing where people do have to do a little bit of digging to eliminate the possibility of a crisis. And the next thing I need to do to make this a story worth reading, not just like, oh, false alarm, a story for anyone, regardless of how into volcanology they are, is addressing the elephant in the room, which is like, are volcanoes dangerous? Which is something a lot of us don't spend a lot of time thinking about. Like, could an eruption happen? There's a safety concern you need to address before you dig deeper into anything else. And we have a lot of new residents in Washington state who might not have realized some of these guys are still, quote unquote, alive as far as volcanoes go. I'm also trying to explain that not everyone in Western Washington is equally impacted by each mountain, and there are different types of dangers volcanoes present. And because I'm not a marketing department for USGS, I'm also talking about areas where more work needs to be done to keep people safe if something does happen. And then I'm trying to anticipate, what are the other things that people might want to know here? Once they know, like, okay, this isn't the cause for panic, how do we know that? Is there a cause for panic outside of this right now? Like, how safe can I feel, like, in this moment? Then you go to, if this is a possibility, if eruption's a possibility, how will I know when to panic? So you give them an overview of the systems that monitor volcanoes and show people just how unlikely it is that a mountain will erupt without something immediately triggering for someone who's in a position to put out an emergency alert for an impacted area. You tell people, here's who will give you breaking news information from the ground and how much time you'll have before, to react to that. And so once we're all on the same page about risk, the next thing I'm trying to include is, can we add some unique value by reflecting on what it means now that we've had to report on this? Like, all of this happened, now what? Why do we have to go through this ordeal? What does it tell us about living in the Pacific Northwest that people reacted this way? And how much people know about volcanoes? How do we avoid situations like this? It's a story now about misperception and risk perception and how we think about and plan for disaster. It's a story about how little we know about volcanoes, how a lack of knowledge can make us panic unnecessarily. So luckily, when I was putting out feelers to people who were involved with volcanoes, I have sources that I've built up over the years, and I was like, I might need you. Will you be available to chat? And some people were like, I'm homesick with COVID, so I'm free. And I'm like, I'm so sorry, but also thank you. So I had people who I thought I might need and made good bets on that. So now I'm interviewing people like emergency managers who, I'm interviewing in a very different mindset, not like where should people be going? Like, where are the, emergency shelters, or how do we get people out of the city? But like, I'm talking to them about how they think about risk and how they help people internalize their actual vulnerability and prepare for disasters. And at this point, after equipping readers with the information they need to decide what kind of risk they're willing to accept in their life and how professionals think about that risk, that's when people are more, not always, but more receptive to considering lifestyle changes, the actionable, okay, now what part of it. If they're concerned about volcanoes or any disaster, what can they do and what can people in power do? And this approach resonated really well. We weren't just talking about the fact that something happened, but about how the fact that something happened shows us an area for growth that is super specific to this part of the country. And my editor was super flexible, allowing me to keep refreshing the angle as new information came in and thinking with me about what kind of information people might want. So something that I want you to take away from this is situations change and you have to be flexible enough to adjust for new information and deciding whether the story is still worth publishing. It's also important not to talk down to people. We could all make a mistake about something happening outside, even the experts. I'm not an expert, I just interview them. And news can set the standard for what people think is common knowledge, and people will tune out if they're feeling patronized to or othered.
Shortly after.
Oh, there we go. And so the second story that I want to talk with you about is a story where even the best laid plans can get waylaid. So my goal here was doing an update story about air conditioning equity. I didn't have any big expectations, nothing fancy. It was a story publishing over the holidays. This is a very recent story that published at the end of December. And that was not what I ended up reporting out. It was, but it was just a part of it. And so even for breaking news stories, you're often relying on previous reporting for sources, for topic knowledge. When you have the ability to schedule an enterprise story out in time. So an enterprise story is a story based on a question, often that you or a reader or an editor had based on what you've noticed about the world. It's something that you do proactively. You start a conversation kind of. It gives you some wiggle room. But like I said, the best laid plans can get upended when you thought you were going to be doing something and that's new information comes in during that process that forces you to switch direction. And so at the end of the year, my editor asked us all to think about a story we'd reported on that we could follow up on. And it had to be, like I said, something simple. My editor liked a piece I'd written about air conditioning equity back in June or July. And they asked me to follow up on that generally, probably thinking I'd focus mostly on this one program focused on vulnerable populations, specifically renters. I think it's important to think about stuff like this when it's not hot out so we can plan ahead. Anyway, the story ballooned a little bit. I wanted to know not just whether this one state program was making progress, but whether King County, where the majority of the people receiving assistance from that program lived, was getting more air conditioned. And what I realized soon was that city and county departments don't really track air conditioning installation here. And after checking in with people I'd talked to last summer for stories about how Seattle and King County were preparing to keep people safe during the heat wave, I discovered a US Census survey, the one with the best available data about air conditioning installation, had come out in late September, and no one in the country really had reported on it, which made sense. Like, there are so many disasters and crises happening all the time. We don't usually have time to report on things when they're not immediate problems, and readers don't often have the emotional bandwidth to read about them. Anyway, I decided to crunch some numbers from the survey, and after plugging them into a data visualization tool, I was able to show that, at least according to this survey, Seattle was no longer the least air-conditioned major metro area in the US, which it had been for a bit, which made sense. You know, we used to have a much more temperate climate, and our buildings were built around that. So now this story that was supposed to be just about air conditioning equity for the most part is now a story where I can contextualize that within the city is making strides in air conditioning, a tool that is a necessary, albeit imperfect tool in the short term for keeping people safe. is everyone getting access to this tool? And if not, what are the barriers to it? And it's now a solution story with new data to back it up. So I started interviewing HVAC installers, putting out social media feelers to find people who'd tried to find air conditioning and couldn't, talking to people on the street. There's so many ways to find sources, and highlighting how even as the city made progress, or the county made progress, some hurdles to air conditioning remain, but there's still this program making air conditioning more accessible, and it is making strides too. So it wasn't the story I thought I'd be telling, but it ended up being way more work than what my editor wanted me to be doing during the holidays. But I thought it was a story worth telling, and it ended up being a really good bet. People responded really well to it. And I was glad to hear that some people told me that it made them think a little bit more about what they were going to do this summer, now that we are more confident in expecting that people will have to have extreme heat plans for themselves, their neighbors, their communities, as the years go on here. And my editors would have been well within their rights to tell me, no, just do the original story. If the data piece still isn't something other people are publishing when we get back from break, like, do that then. But they gave me a longer leash and trusted me while helping me refine my framing. And it is really important to have a good team. So it looks like we're almost approaching a half-hour mark. So I want to take a second to look at, I've thrown so much information at you about, the headspace that you're in when you go into reporting out a news story, and the types of framing that you could be keeping in the back of your mind as you're reporting it out. So there are a lot of ways to tell a story well, but knowing what your audience wants can help you land on an engaging and useful presentation. You sometimes only know what the presentation is once you have more of the pieces. So, being willing to accept that this isn't always a linear process, and, advocating when you can for a little extra time to be more thoughtful about what you're doing can be really important. Don't go into a story thinking you know exactly what's up. The story you think you're going to tell might not be the story you should tell. And most of my stories work because I listen to my sources instead of strong arming them into a narrative. And working with your editors to accommodate new information on deadline is important. So I really appreciate you all letting me come in and talk to you about something that I think is really important, which is kind of just being more aware of who you are when you are reporting, and what the assumptions that you make about why you're doing what you're doing. So I would love to hear about what you actually wanted to hear me talk about today with your questions, and thanks for listening.
All right, thank you so much for that, Hannah. I am going to stop the YouTube